it's been really fascinating to watch. Karen, Google has long been an advocate of the positive role that technology can play in terms of addressing global challenges. Talk to us about what's going on in Russia and Google's role. I know you've stayed in the country, but it's only for your free services, and you haven't been obeying the new Russian law on what you should be doing on content moderation. How do you balance these things, and tell us what you've been up to?
Thank you very much, Karen. First, happy anniversary to GMF. Very happy to be here. I think it's interesting because the war is both, online and offline. And I think the war online has actually been quite important. And, the whole disinformation, has been really, surfacing very much. And so if you take companies like us, but other tech companies have been doing the same. I mean, we've been basically working 24/7. We're doing 4 things. First is fighting disinformation. It's extremely important. It's quite big. So we've been doing things like, removing content. If you take YouTube, for instance, we've removed about, I'm not going to say something stupid, 8,000 channels, 60,000 videos since February. On the other platform, we've removed more than 3.5 million videos. So it gives you an idea of, the size of what we're talking about. We've also, taken a policy by which, Ukraine is associated with the fact that you cannot actually say this is not a war or minimize it. So every time there is content like that, we remove it. And also, we've been making sure that, we respect the sanctions. So, regarding the Russian media, they've been removed from search, and they've been removed from our Play Store. But to go what you're saying as well, what has been very important is that, and it's amazing, but YouTube and search are still available in Russia. And we're part of the few, organizations that allow to give the, I would say, the real content, in Russia. And Zelensky's video are actually running quite high, and so people can see it. Also, free radios can be seen on YouTube. And I find this actually quite extraordinary to actually be able to rebalance this information. And in Ukraine, also, we've been helping with our different services. So, for instance, if there is a bomb coming up, we've worked with the Ukrainian government to create an app so that they've got a real-time alert, and then the people can actually go on map and see where there is a shelter nearby. So we're doing these kind of things has been quite important. And then the last bit is cybersecurity. I mean, we have teams working on cybersecurity, 24/7 as well. They basically track and then they remove the cyber attacks. We've put a lot of the Ukrainian ministries, the journalists, the NGOs, we've put them on our cloud, which is cyber protected. And in a way, what I find interesting, there's been some cyber attack, but you could have expected from the Russians to be much more. But actually it was, I would say, higher, but to a certain level as before. So interesting.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to get now into the the EU-US Trade and Tech Council, which I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but it was launched before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but then it's been sort of reinvigorated, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the transatlantic cooperation since then. But Peter, can you talk to us a little bit about the TTC's role at this moment, especially regarding tech regulation? So at the Paris meeting, there was this commitment to, I think, a structured policy dialogue. I think that's what was said in terms of digital strategy and also preventing trade barriers. And how do you see this? What do you expect to come out of it that's actually useful?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I actually just want to pick up for 30 seconds on the previous question. Yeah. I want to say from the U.S. government's perspective, we have really welcomed the decisions by some of the major platforms to stay in Russia and to try to, while staying in Russia, keep kind of misinformation offline. You asked me to talk about the export controls, but we've actually been very careful across our sanctions and export controls to have carve-outs to allow telecom companies, platforms, social media companies, and the rest to stay on. So legally they can stay on in Russia because we do think it's important for the folks in Russia to be able to have, it's a constricting space there, but to be able to have access to that information. And we are sort of encouraging continued dialogue and want continued dialogue with the companies to make sure that those avenues of communication remain open. So very much welcome what you all have been doing. On the TTC, look, I think over the last several years, there's obviously been a substantial shift both in Europe and in the United States towards a more pro-regulatory approach towards large tech companies. And we've seen that in sort of competition policy. We've seen that in issues of kind of content moderation and platform accountability. We've seen that in terms of data privacy and these kinds of issues. And I think there is sort of broad support on both sides of the Atlantic for a more pro-regulatory approach. Now, I think where there are differences of view is in exactly how you do that. And I think from an American perspective, we have tried to have a very good line of dialogue with our European counterparts about how we can kind of do things together and regulate the tech space in a way that doesn't have adverse consequences for cybersecurity, that doesn't have adverse consequences for entrepreneurs who are trying to build companies. It doesn't have adverse consequences for consumers, who want to be able to move from platform to platform and don't want a lot of new kind of, checkbox headache kinds of things that they have to deal with. And so what we're trying to do through the TTC and what we've now committed to do through the TTC is to have a structured dialogue on the implementation of the Digital Markets Act, which is a landmark piece of tech regulation here in Europe, on some of the Digital Services Act issues, and then looking over the horizon to have discussions around Data Act, AI Act, Cloud Act, some of these other over-the-horizon issues, to make sure that we are able to approach these issues cooperatively, that we minimize some of these unintended consequences, and we actually have an effective regulatory regime rather than a regulatory regime that just kind of creates friction and doesn't actually work for consumers, which I think is the ultimate goal here.
I'll just follow up with one question. It's been really fascinating to watch from the outside, as I've seen a lot of people who thought of themselves as purely foreign policy people or purely international economic policy people have to become tech people too and think about how to balance all these issues that you've been talking about.
I think there are a couple of pieces to that. I mean, we are in an era, as I think everybody around this room has been talking for the last 2 days, we're in an era of geopolitical competition, right? We're in an era of geopolitical competition with Russia, and we're in an era of geopolitical competition with China. And a major area of that competition, particularly with China, is in the technology sector. Yeah. And that means ensuring that we are investing here at home, and by home I mean across kind of liberal democracies, not just in the US, to make sure we maintain our innovative edge. It means creating regulatory ecosystems that foster and help rather than hindering kind of entrepreneurialism, growth of our own companies and the like. And it means, figuring out in a smart and targeted way how to push back on, some of the really malign things our competitors are doing in surveillance, in, AI for surveillance, in a variety of other technological domains. And so as you say, in the 80s, the world of competition was, tanks across European battlefields. Now, maybe we're back in part of Europe now, but that was sort of the world of competition. In the 90s and 2000s, we kind of believed the world is flat, and that's not the world we live in anymore. But in this era of competition, technology is where it's happening. So you have to kind of think about the nexus of these issues.
Thanks. So Karen, with the TTC, again, what are your hopes in terms of, I imagine as a company, seeing different regulatory regimes in different countries is an opportunity, but also a challenge. And what do you hope to see, or what is possible, do you think, to come out of the TTC in terms of resolving some of those issues?
Thank you. I would agree with Peter. I mean, sometimes it's actually very challenging. But I think it's interesting because, in one way, the war has reinvigorated, the relationship between the EU and the US. And then you can see what, non-democratic regimes can do to the internet, which is like closing themselves down, closing on the people. But, in parallel, we've seen, honestly, a fragmentation of legislation and of digital legislation. So, I mean, there is a study that came out recently by a think tank and a university which says that for the G20 countries, since 2020, there's been 1,700 legislation or regulatory steps on digital. So it shows you, that it's drifting into fragmentation. And this has a huge impact, of course, into the economy, the trade, because as you say, digital is inherent to basically a lot of the economies and the sectors. And for us, what's very important is that the TTC is a unique opportunity to get the US and the EU to align together on these standards, on this legislation, but also maybe to actually have a coalition of the willing, to bring other countries as well, because we should be a bloc and we should make sure that the regulation kind of align together. And I think that's quite important. That's what we would welcome as well. Because there is only one internet, so there should be like one AI way to do it, in a democratic way. There should all be alignment about what is disinformation, illegal content, and not have, like 27 different versions of it, in only one continent.
Well, following up on that, so Europe's got this Digital Services Act, and now there's a new revived code of practice on disinformation. As Google takes a look at those and what kinds of procedures you're going to have to put in place. So the DSA, for those who don't know, is about reducing the risk of illegal content spreading online, and the code of practice is about reducing disinformation. I mean, would you see applying some of those procedures that you put in place to comply with those? Would you see putting them in place in other parts of the world?
I mean, I was listening to the European Commission, who said they're going to have to hire 120 people, to implement the DSA. Well, that's what we do as well. So they're mind-blowing, legislation. It means a lot. But of course, the DSA and the Code of Disinformation, that's actually just the beginning, because now we need to implement it. So we're going to have to make proposals about how we see it, check it with the Commission. And it's going to take us a lot of months to do that. But I mean, absolutely. I mean, we doom if we don't do something, we doom if we do something. So at least now there is a regulation which tells us about how to do it. And for us, it does make sense to align to certain principles about how we do that, globally. So it may not be just a copy and paste, but of course the principle will be certainly, replicated and used.
So the U.S. is going to piggyback on Europe, I guess.
At least that's a European dream.
So I wanted to follow up on this topic about the siloing of the internet, because you put that on the table, and Peter, you were alluding to it before when you were saying you're glad that tech companies are still at least providing connections in Russia. And I thought it was really interesting, actually, that the U.S., when Ukraine asked the U.S., or asked ICANN to cut off Russia from the names and numbering, the U.S. stayed back, and ICANN said no, and the U.S. has encouraged, that we're not going to cut citizens off from the internet. So we're keeping that principle clear that the internet can provide access to information and free expression. And I know, were a leader on this declaration for the future of the internet, which brought 60 countries together, and it's really about, I think, open societies being a little bit more muscular, I think, in protecting the open internet and addressing some of the weaponization of the internet by authoritarians. Can you tell us about that balancing act and what you're hoping for the future of the declaration?
Yeah, so the Declaration for the Future of the Internet is an initiative that was really a sort of a joint initiative of the European Union and the US, kind of spun out of the TTC to bring together a coalition of 60, I think 61 now, because we got the South Koreans to come in just a couple of weeks ago, countries around the world to get aligned behind a set of kind of conceptual principles about what the future of the internet should be. In a way, kind of updating the principles that underpin the birth of the internet in the 80s and 90s. So, today it's sort of aligned around principles on today, what does it mean for an internet that is open, secure, interoperable, and reliable, where we are reaffirming commitments, to things like not blocking and degrading internet sites and not censoring people online. But where we're also committing to digital access and digital inclusion. As the UN reminds us, there are 3 billion people around the world who are not regularly online. What can we do to actually have that digital inclusion? To have an internet economy, kind of what we were just talking about, that is competitive, where entrepreneurs and businesses of all sizes from around the world can compete and thrive. To have an internet where there are strong cybersecurity standards and the like. So we really thought we needed to kind of lay out a conceptual for kind of the liberal democratic world. What is our vision of the internet? That we had 60 countries launch back in April. On the US side, it was hosted by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. On the European side, it was hosted by Commissioner Vestager and Commissioner Breton. And we're carrying that forward by signing up new members. And then we're going to be looking to civil society. We're going to be looking to do an event later this year where we're going to bring in civil society and other stakeholders to kind of hold our feet to the fire and give us advice on how we should actually be implementing these principles at a national level.
I want to welcome our third panelist, Eva Kaili. Thank you for coming.
So I'm there and I'm following. And
Well, maybe we've been talking a little bit about the European regulations, and I know that you've been very focused on fostering innovation, fostering entrepreneurship, new industries in Europe. And I wonder, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the various regulations that Europe has put on the table and how you think they could contribute or hinder some of that entrepreneurship.
So just to say that I've started working on artificial intelligence like at least 5 years ago, and what triggered that was like a visit we did in US, where we visited like the biggest universities in academia, and they told us that they alerted us of what AI means to everything, especially in autonomous weapons, and how geopolitical it becomes. And they said, if Europe doesn't start doing something about it, then nobody will. And actually, through US, EU started to do a bit more on the regulation side. And we started to call for an ethical framework in applying AI rules, and also for robotics, and also even for other technologies and the convergence of those technologies now at the metaverse, like blockchain use, because we realized that we have the technologies. Everybody realized that during the pandemic. We saw that we could actually telework, we saw we could actually televote, that we can have teleeducation, but we didn't choose to do that before. So we had to follow specific principles, as you very well mentioned, and we need to be aligned in those principles as democracies, that we want to be progressive, but safeguard what we achieved so far. So to translate offline what we managed to safeguard, the values and the priorities we have also online. I say that because to collaborate and align with like-minded partners globally, it's extremely important, as we now realize with what's happening with China, with Russia, and we see also the implications we have in the digital era. So we can say we have more that unite us to work together. We have set up the first, I would say, effort to regulate the internet after like 20, 30 years that we hadn't done so. And to make sure that it's going to be open to entrepreneurs and to competition, and also there will be rules and clear responsibilities for the stakeholders, and people and citizens will know where their data are located, and who has responsibility for specific services, and how can they complain, and also because online, there are no physical borders, and still it's not clear what happens with our data if they go from cloud to cloud. And we have to make sure we will complete, actually, these efforts. And I'm very happy that the TTC is taking place, because we need to be aligned. It's not nice if we develop something and then we try to figure out the overlapping, or trying to make sure it's going to work also with at least US. But I'm quite optimistic that we have initially a common agreement, a common compass and vision, and we need to fine-tune the details there. And now more than ever, it's becoming very geopolitical to achieve that.
So this panel has been very agreeable and agreeing, but I have a feel I'm going to turn to Karen and see what you think about what was just said about the data.
Me to disagree.
About knowing where our data is, and you were talking about the Data Act before.
Yeah, I mean, well, first I wanted to say that we actually support the open internet, because it's and that brings back to the discussion I had on the TTC. We need to align on the regulatory framework. Either it is the national framework, like the Privacy Shield, so interoperability of national rules.
Yeah.
Or actually making sure that the rules that are created in one continent align as well, because as you say, AI is applied globally, and then disinformation has to be fought globally. So we need to make sure we align on some principles. What's important for me on the TTC is about the fact that we don't have the national legislation, like European legislation on AI or Data Act, which goes on into their way and are not being discussed as well at the at the TTC level. And if I take the Data Act as an example, I mean, it could be conflicting actually with the upcoming Privacy Shield. It can be conflicting as well with the EU-US Cloud Act. So we need to have these discussions together so that actually we reinforce each other in exchange of actually fragmenting, as I was saying before. we have as well, as for Google, we now have, into that a kind of DMA gatekeeper, which we find very excessive, which is also contradicting with the GDPR. So again,
you have to say what all those initials mean.
Oh, yeah, I know. Well,
this isn't a tech world here.
The GDPR being, I hope everybody knows the GDPR now because it's been implemented for quite some time and it's going to be revised. It's a private, it's data privacy for the people. And the DMA is basically the competition legislation which has just been implemented at European level, making sure that, when you're a big company, you're not going to be abusing of your position. And the AI Act as well, is quite important for us. We've seen the latest draft from the Council, which is basically, putting the general use into the high-risk use, which we actually find quite problematic because this is actually going to prevent, I would say, the spread of AI for like the classic use. So I think that's the kind of things that, through a dialogue, I believe we can actually address on making sure we don't actually, ending up doing what we don't want to do, which is, not to use AI.
So I want to talk about two broader issues that I think people here who may be foreign policy people, not necessarily tech people, can really sink their teeth into, and then we'll open it up to questions. And those two issues are industrial policy and disinformation, because I know those have both been issues that have been discussed very broadly, and people are really worried about it. So if we start with the topic of disinformation, and I know in Europe it's also talked about in terms of illegal content often, and the proliferation of it. What are you hoping to see from the DSA and the new code of practice, and especially related to elections, things like pandemics, extremism? Do you really think that there's going to be, after all this regulatory activity, that there'll really be some changes?
Well, actually, I think we're going to see a lot happening. One of the things that exist in the AI Act, and I understand that still is not very clear how it's going to be implemented, but I think it's very important because we're highlighting the biggest challenges we might face on the internet against our democracies. We might have actually experienced some through the Cambridge Analytica case, when data have been used to target so much specific, like a very small percentage of the citizens in order to vote for Brexit. Could have affected the result, maybe not, but we don't know. It was so close. So with this information, I think what's really important at this point to have is to avoid manipulation of perception by excess influence of the timeline, especially with content that could be from illegal to like fake news to completely something that over-personalization changes how we see things. And not everybody participates in such panels and is knowledgeable about how the internet works. My mother is calling me and telling me, so you see what happened like today, it was on my Facebook, and it's like, it was not on mine. So I haven't. We're looking at different content and see things, everybody's seeing the same things. It's not the case. I believe we can develop better the algorithms by design. This is, again, something that is challenging, but technologically possible to have more safeguards. We need to make sure to talk about children and how they can also be protected. We have a lot of discussion still ahead of us, but at least we know that we are starting to, to do something about it. And again, when you see how we have external interference with our elections. We had recently launched a committee on surveillance and software that can be developed outside the EU, but it can also basically hijack our devices and completely have full control of the device, not just the content, but like full control to manufacture like a text and to send an email like it was you. We've seen how deep fakes have developed and how really extremely dangerous this could be in terms of like having elections and not being able to verify the credibility of a video or not. So I think we really need to act. I understand that everybody's like, with regulation, they want maybe less. They want legal certainty, but no regulation. We have to find the balance there. We have to be smart. We have to understand that technology gives us possibilities to become better. Subliminal manipulation. This is something that's very tricky. We have to explain it well because targeted advertisement is a business model for a lot of the GAFAs, at least part of their business, maybe not completely. And we need to make sure that it will also follow some rules, or it would give options to citizens, and by design, it will safeguard a lot of things. And also banning social scoring. I think it's something that in Europe is something that we don't feel.
Can you explain to folks what social scoring is?
Social scoring means I can check all the data that you leave while you're like Google searching or while you're using your Facebook, and I can understand if you're like good citizens or if you had COVID or if you have like another disease and you can have access to public services or not. You can have access to a specific insurance company or not. You might have to pay more to have such access. You might have special benefits or not. This is something that is a reality in China. It's being used extensively, like the use of the digital power to understand where citizens are and to maybe even not allow them this freedom of move that we have here, besides the extreme circumstances of a pandemic, but then that was temporary, and we are talking about democracies. So we completely said that we don't want this to be the case. We haven't even started talking about the private sector. Should you be fired by an algorithm? And then don't you want to have the right to redress? Don't you want to have the right to an explanation? Don't you have the right to make a mistake? Don't you want the algorithm to have specific social criteria and some, ethical metrics there by design? So this is possible, but it's not developed yet.
So I'm sure we'll get more disinformation questions, especially for you, Karen, when I open it up. But I just want to put on the table, because Senator Chris Murphy was talking about it a lot before, that we need to think about industrial policy if the democracies want to take leadership on some of the technologies, some of the industries of the future. And I know in Europe, there's the movement on semiconductors and supply chains, and also in the US. And maybe I'll just start with Peter on this, and maybe you can just talk a little bit about the view. I know that some who are now in leadership in the administration talked about an industrial policy. Those words had not been used in the US for decades. What are the prospects? What have we already done? And what are the other things that the US could do and do in concert with our allies?
Well, I'd begin by saying I think we as an administration, I think as Senator Murphy has said publicly, there's growing bipartisan support in Washington for the idea that the U.S., joined with our allies, needs to do some targeted, smart industrial policy. I mean, first I'd say I don't think it's a new idea that the U.S. should do industrial policy. There's been sort of a pendulum throughout American history, going back to, say, Hamilton, on whether we should do industrial policy. And certainly in the post-World War II era, you saw a bunch of investments by the government that laid the foundation for a bunch of technologies that we're using today. And I think you're seeing the pendulum kind of swing back that direction. Not that we should have sort of central planning. That's not who we are. But where in this era of geopolitical competition, we can identify, a couple of key technologies or that we need to maintain a lead in or develop a lead in, or some key supply chains where, for national security reasons, we just don't want to be dependent on our competitors, even if our competitors offer us cheaper goods than we make at home. You need industrial policy to foster the investment in the innovation ecosystem. And again, for the sort of targeted critical supply chain goods where you have a national security interest in ensuring you have adequate domestic production, you need industrial policy to do that. We've kind of laid out a theory of the case on industrial policy. First instance on supply chains with a bunch of reports we put out last year on supply chains, and then earlier this year in a speech more generally on industrial policy that National Economic Council Director Brian Deese gave. And the view there really is that, it's going to be targeted, it's going to foster, investments, and it's going to be done in cooperation with our allies and partners. And on that last point, I think we're really focused, I'm being here in Europe, I'll talk about what we're doing with Europe. We're really talking about two ways of doing this together. First way is where there are areas we both are making investments, what are ways in which we can make those investments cooperatively? So, for example, we have an interest in securing critical mineral supply chains for things like lithium for the electric vehicle transition. That's an area where the US and Europe can actually invest together in lithium mining and processing, so we're not totally dependent, as we are today, on China for so much, particularly on the processing. Then there on the technology side, we really want to make sure that we are making these investments in a cooperative way that isn't simply a race to the bottom with subsidies. And so on the TTC, for example, you've seen us lay out last month a set of clear transatlantic principles as we both look to provide some subsidies for semiconductor manufacturing on what those subsidies should be so that we are actually encouraging investment in Europe and in the US compared to investment in China, so like drawing it out of China and into the West, rather than just getting into some kind of bidding war against one another over where a particular fab's going to land. So it sort of needs some cooperation and parameters on what those incentives are going to look like.
That's great. So I want to open it up to all of you. Does anyone have a question? Yes? Do we have mics? Thank you.
Thank you. If you allow me to wear my mask, it's part of the ensemble. Hi, my name is George Flavis. I work at the Prime Minister's office at the Greek Parliament. Thank you for your input. My question goes to all of you. We mentioned a lot about digital policies and regulatory policies in the EU, and the US is often perceived as a source of innovation and technology ecosystem. We had a very nice, interesting yesterday night owl session about China's influence in Africa and the way that for many years, many decades now, that you have biometrics and AI systems been developed a lot in Africa in exchange of infrastructure and so forth. What would be your opinion and approach in the sense of Europe and the US together working in countries that are now developing their digital presence, they're developing their technological infrastructures? In legal theory, we have this concept of legal transplant, where countries will take legal rules from another country and import it in their own. So the EU as a normative giant and the US as a technological innovator, how you two can combine in order to assist those countries?
Thank you. That's quite a question. Who would like to start?
Well, that's a tough question, actually, because I have the feeling that the recent years we experienced that US is like throwing it back into US, and we've seen other players acting in our neighborhood, if we talk about Africa and also Middle East, and I believe now we feel they're like coming back. So I have the feeling that we have a great possibility there to work together. Even just talking about semiconductors production and like changing how we see our supply chains, it's extremely important. We are combining 50 billion in US and 43 from EU. I don't know if it's going to be 43 or like even more, because just Intel is developing now a 33 billion of investment in semiconductors. So it's going to be big if we try to understand what's the cutting edge technology we want to invest in, and then in terms of our allies and how we can together do more, I think the most important thing is to make sure we are aligned in principle with all the things we want to achieve, and then develop a better strategy of collaboration also abroad. I don't see that happening in Africa. I think it's extremely important. China is already there. They are influencing a lot infrastructure, telecoms. They have access to most of the countries, but we can build these bridges together. For example, EU just recently opened up a file now of discussion to give the visa free, so no visa needed for Kuwait and Qatar. United Arab Emirates don't have it already, so this means like these three countries of the Arab Peninsula, they can come, they can invest, they can travel without the need of a visa. So there are tools that we can develop together and also to co-invest. But first we need to also map and identify our common priorities. I don't know if everybody's knowledgeable on the semiconductors, but when 70% of the production is in the hands of Taiwan, we just have 10% in EU, 10% in US, and we woke up in the pandemic and we realized that, oh, the supply chains can be really so disrupted that you order a vehicle and then the sensor arrives 3 years later to have a touch screen. Then you say, okay, now I have to invest on those, and then we have to double it, to do 20% and 20%, so together 40%. Definitely we have to align. Definitely we have to explore our new sources and supply chains through other trusted partners, I would say.
do you want to
Very
add one
briefly,
thing?
yeah,
Sure.
just as I think about this on competing with China and out-competing their kind of digital authoritarian vision in the developing world, which is a huge priority for us, I think of two pillars. Pillar one is, what are the standards we want to be out and promoting, and what are the values we want to be out and promoting? And pillar two is, what are the technologies to actually go out and build the infrastructure, and where's the money for that coming from, right? And from I think a US-EU perspective, at least from a US perspective, joined by our allies on the standards side, this is really where we see the DFI, the Declaration for the Future of the Internet that we talked about earlier, coming in, right? That's a high standard vision of what the internet should look like that we've gotten 60 countries to join. We're going to continue to promote in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. And then on the kind of physical infrastructure and technology side, we have to be willing to step up and put resources that say, if you want to adhere, if you are going to join us on the standards, we're going to be there to help you build the network infrastructure that's going to meet those standards. And that's why I think it was so important that just yesterday at the G7 leaders announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is a new, over a number of years, 5 or 6 years, galvanizing $600 billion of investment for infrastructure in the developing world. It's kind of a big sort of digital telecom infrastructure window, and you kind of overlay the money and the technology coming in with the standards, and I think you really have a comprehensive vision and package that looks very appealing compared to what China is putting on the market.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because it's been something that has been talked about in the West, but we haven't really done much until this big announcement yesterday. It was really interesting. Here.
Me? Sorry.
Oh, did you want to respond?
No,
Karen?
yeah, I just agree with Peter in the sense that if we, we have the same values. So if we get a line between the US and the EU, we're like basically almost like a billion people, in terms of the standards and the way to do it, which I think provides a good model for other countries to actually choose that model if they want. And that's what I very much hope we can achieve with the TTC.
Go ahead.
So, hello everyone. My name is Arba Kokalari, and I'm also a member of the European Parliament, colleague with Eva. I've been the lead negotiator for the biggest political group for the Digital Services Act, which was one of the big laws that you were discussing here. And I understand that is a bit hesitation from the US right now among these laws, but nobody loves to regulate because we love to regulate. I don't know how it is in the US, but here in Europe, our laws when it comes to e-commerce and e-trade and the internet haven't been updated since over 20 years. I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't have even social media or Facebook or smartphones. So basically, our whole life is on these platforms today. So in able to have a free and safe internet, we need to make sure that we have some kind of order in this digital Wild West. And my question is, so basically what we try to do is to make that balance on to decrease disinformation, but still have transparency on algorithm, and still make sure that we have competition and also push back the flow of illegal products from China, which is hampering competition. So we really try to balance.
I have to ask you for a question.
And I want Mr. Harrell to be a little bit more specific. When are you planning to do something about this? Because our law will come into force in a few months, and for the small platforms in 1.5 years. You want an effective regime which is balanced. Here is the product. So when are you going to do something about it so we can work together and have a safe and free internet both in Europe and the US?
Peter, when are you going to fix the internet in the U.S.?
Yeah, tomorrow. No, look, I appreciate the question and the comment, and I think we, as the Biden administration, have been clear throughout the last year, watching the steps you've taken, that we share and welcome many of the goals of both the DSA and the DMA. I think you've seen us say that publicly. I think that was clear in the discussions we've had privately, and we indeed are pursuing in our Congress many kind of comparable provisions in many ways. Now, we have also been clear that we do think there depending on implementation, certain aspects of like the way in which interoperability might be implemented that could contribute to cybersecurity risks. And we're not opposed to interoperability on platforms, but we want to make sure that as that's implemented, there are ways to mitigate those cybersecurity risks. So I think we've been clear we share the goals. I think we've tried to work constructively and have worked constructively and appreciate the kind of changes that were made as the DMA and DSA were finalized, and look forward to working on implementation. In terms of the U.S., look, obviously there are a couple of proposals in our Congress on both privacy issues and on competition policy issues, as well as on sort of content moderation. Content moderation, obviously particularly complicated in the U.S. given our free speech protections and the like. And that's why we have, on content moderation as an administration working with Europe, we've been focusing on issues around transparency, around harmful products, things like that, where we do see a lot of opportunity to work together, as well as on foreign, like Russian misinformation. On the competition policy side, I can't speak to what our Congress is doing. It's obviously a very active topic of debate right now. There are bills moving through our Congress right now. And we'll just have to sort of see where those go over the next couple of months. But I think that is one that you've seen very actively being debated in our Congress right now.
So I think we're at 0 time, so I have to leave it there. I think it's always good to leave the audience wanting more. That means that our panel has been really engaging. I know this was a really detailed conversation, but I think it's incredibly important that we merge the foreign policy, the technology, and the economic policy, and you all have done such a brilliant job. Thank you very much.